So hello everyone, my name is David Hicks, as Professor Tower said. And so in this session, I'm going to be focusing on some of the structural analysis tools in AFLOW. In particular, there's three that I'm briefly going to highlight. One is AFLOW-SYM, the AFLOW Prototype Encyclopedia, and AFLOW-XtalFinder. And so the functionality that I'm going to be showing today is mostly going to be the online component of this, but as Professor Tower said, we also have, if you were to download the AFLOW code, you could run these in a more programmatic fashion, and we also have Python scripts, Python wrappers as well, if you prefer Python over the command line. So just a little bit of motivation behind this particular session is the tools that I'm going to be discussing could be used as structural tools to aid in machine learning training for different material models. So in particular, the information or the materials we've been discussing are with respect to coordinate models. So we know the lattice vectors and the atom positions. And so we can analyze these, analyze this with AFLOW tools to get things like symmetry, atomic geometries, similarity between structures, to compose things like descriptors. So you can take space group, Pearson symbol, create feature vectors, and then you could potentially feed this into one of your machine learning models to do structure property predictions. And so the other component to this is the tools that I'm going to be discussing is crystal generation. So in AFLOW, we've created a prototype generator that takes backbone crystal structures, and you can decorate these structures with different elements. So for instance, you can create these three compounds here based on that single structure. And this is built into the AFLOW software, so you can do this programmatically. And so you can generate new hypothetical materials, and you could potentially feed them into the AFLOW ML model that Professor Osis is going to be discussing to do quick screening of materials and their properties. Or you could potentially use it to train your own machine learning models. So I'll quickly go through some of the modules, and then I'll go through a couple of exercises to show you how you can use these online tools. So the first tool is AFLOW-SYM. So it's appropriately named AFLOW-SYM because it determines the symmetry of your crystal. So it determines the invariance of a crystal under particular transformations. So that would be mirror planes, n-fold rotations, roto-inversions. And from this information, you can get descriptors such as the space group, Bravais lattice, Pearson symbol, and also the Wyckoff positions. And so a lot of people say, oh, you know, all the symmetries are tabulated if you just look them up in a table. But I wanted to highlight that there's some subtleties that go into actually the calculation or determination of the space groups in real materials. And so to highlight this, let's imagine that you had a coordinate model and you had this arrangement of atoms. So to determine what symmetries you have in a crystal, you need to apply these isometries or symmetries to the atomic arrangement. So essentially you take this set of atom positions, you apply, let's say, a fourfold rotation, and you see how the original atom set superimposes onto the transformed atom set. And if they superimpose perfectly or within a certain threshold, then you would say this is a symmetry that your crystal exhibits. And there's kind of three different scenarios you might encounter. The perfect or ideal scenario, if we were just working, you know, with pure mathematics, you would get this, you know, pure mapping once you do this fourfold rotation. On the other hand, you might have this scenario at the bottom here, where maybe you rotate, you have two atom positions and you do the fourfold and you don't map onto any atom positions. So you would say this is not an isometry. But the most common condition that we would find is something in the middle here where maybe we're slightly offset. And that's because we're working with real materials. Maybe there's a finite temperature that causes the atoms to shift from their ideal positions. And so the question becomes, should this be a mapping in our crystal? So in general, we apply a tolerance threshold, which we refer to as epsilon-SYM. And this tells us that if all of the atom positions are within this threshold, epsilon, and you do one-to-one mappings, then we would say that this is indeed a symmetry of our crystal. But again, since we're working with crystals, there's some hurdles because we have periodic boundary conditions to battle with. And also typically you can represent the crystal in direct coordinates instead of Cartesian coordinates. which is a non-uniform metric space in general. So again, this kind of complicates things with mappings. And so there's a lot of details that go into this, and I'm just going to briefly highlight that AFLOW-SYM essentially takes a lot of these considerations into the determination of the symmetry. So AFLOW-SYM is robust, performs a robust mapping procedure, so we're consistent in both direct and reciprocal spaces. We also have an adaptive tolerance scheme. So again, as a user, you may be wondering what tolerance epsilon-SYM should I use? And so again, to alleviate that burden from the user, AFLOW is consistent at a variety of different symmetries. And the same can't be said for some of the off-the-shelf, the other off-the-shelf symmetry packages in the community. And so for instance, you can see that on this tolerance number line, if you use tighter tolerances, AFLOW-SYM will accurately find lower symmetry, and vice versa. If looser tolerances, you might observe higher symmetry. And there's even a scheme implemented that if you find inconsistent symmetry at a particular symmetry tolerance, then AFLOW-SYM will do a tolerance scan around that position to make sure that it can find consistent symmetry at this new epsilon nu. So again, this is an automatic procedure, and as a user, you don't necessarily have to worry about this, but the takeaway here is that AFLOW-SYM does this under the hood. The other thing that I wanted to mention is to further alleviate this, AFLOW has 2 preset tolerance values, and they're system specific. And what I mean by this is we take into account the minimum interatomic distance in the crystal. And basically that is used as a metric for our tolerance. So we have 2 presets, which are just scaling factors on this metric. And in the next slide, I'll show that these 2 presets are actually very robust, and they allow us to determine consistent symmetry with experimentally resolved symmetries. And so that's what's shown here. So here, just as a proof of concept, we took a set of experimental structures from the ICSD and compared the space group calculated by a symmetry package and compared it to what was determined experimentally. And so the taller this histogram, the worse a particular symmetry package performed with respect to experiment. And so you can see that regardless of what lattice type we're looking at, AFLOW, in comparison to these other symmetry packages, had the fewest number of mismatches. So it's the most consistent with experiment. And you can see that we also gave these other packages essentially another chance by changing their tolerances to see if we could get better results. And so you can see some fluctuation, but the takeaway here is that with AFLOW, you don't need to tune the tolerances, while with some of these other symmetry packages, you may need to tune tolerances by hand to get consistent results. So that was kind of a crash course in some of the details, but now I'll briefly highlight some of the things you can calculate. So with AFLOW, you can calculate essentially all of the relevant symmetry groups for crystallographic structures. So these are the rotations, inversions, roto-inversions for different symmetry groups here. So you can see lattice point group, the unit cell symmetry, and also some of their reciprocal lattice counterparts. In addition, we can also calculate some of the common symmetry descriptors that you might be familiar with. So for instance, the space group number, the different symbols here, the Pearson symbol. And we can also determine the Wyckoff positions. So these are the symmetry equivalent positions in the crystal. And these are consistent with the international tables of crystallography. And so we can determine things like the Wyckoff multiplicity, the Wyckoff letter designation, and the representative coordinate. And in this case, the representative coordinate tells us how many atoms are symmetrically equivalent. And based on the symmetry operator, you can expand this representative coordinate into these 4 here. And so there's some functionality in AFLOW to actually to determine these operations and also do this coordinate expansion. So that's a brief high-level overview of what you can calculate, and I'm actually going to show you how you can do this online. So I'm actually going to leave the presentation for a second. And if you'd like to follow along, please go to aflow.org, as Professor Tower showed. And if you go to this main page and scroll down, you can see some of the AFLOW functionality available online. And this is AFLOW Online. So if you click on this, you can see that there is a postcard or one of those coordinate models already uploaded. And you can see that there's different functionality that you can actually perform. And AFLOW is being called under the hood. And so in this case, we'll go down to Symmetry. And so in this case, you can calculate things like space group, Wyckoff positions, Pearson symbol. So for example, we already have this structure that we've taken. And we go ahead and hit the space group. And then if you hit submit, this is going to tell the online portal to calculate the space group symmetry of this system. So you can see that it's space group 227. Here's the labels and some of the ITC information. And so you can explore some of the different symmetries that you can calculate. Another one that I'll highlight is the symmetry group. So we can calculate, for instance, different symmetry groups, the crystal point group, factor point group. And again, if you hit submit, it will calculate that, and this will return those rotation operations that I mentioned before. So for instance, here you get quite a lot of information. This is more of a human readable form. And you get the rotation matrices, and all of this documentation is in the articles, which I'll provide at the end of the presentation. But the last two things that I wanted to mention is that you can actually, at the top here, you can toggle between a plain text, so human readable output, or a JSON. And then you can also change the symmetry here, the symmetry tolerance to these two presets that I mentioned. And so if you do this, for instance, then it would give you a JSON representation of the symmetry that you wanted calculated. And so you can see that here. And so there's a lot of different functionality that I won't go through, but I encourage you, if you're interested, to kind of explore the different symmetry methods that you can calculate on this page. The other thing that I wanted to mention is you can also visualize the symmetries of the AFLOW.org entries. So I'll go back to this presentation. And for instance, if you go to a particular entry page that Professor Tower showed, and if you click near the JML representation, there's this symmetry tab. And then you can see all of the different symmetries of this crystal, and you can actually highlight them. And you can actually see that if you apply the rotation to the system, you can see how it maps back onto itself. So again, this is a nice tool for visualization, or maybe even for teaching as well. Okay, so that is AFLOW-SYM. The next one that I'll briefly highlight is the AFLOW Prototype Encyclopedia. So as Professor Tower said, we also have within AFLOW, there is built-in prototype encyclopedia. So for instance, you can take common structure types like the Heusler, anti-Heusler, and you can decorate them with different elements to create hypothetical new structures. And available online, there's approximately 1,100 prototypes online, and there's even more if you were to download the AFLOW binary and install it on your computer. And so as part of this, there's the ability to generate prototypes, but there's also a catalog component. And so for instance, we've cataloged many different common prototype structures. We've listed a lot of their descriptors here. And there's a lot of comments about where we got the structures, the references, and there's also a method online to actually generate these structure prototypes. And they span all 230 space groups. And there's been 3 installments, and again, online we have approximately 1,100. So I'll briefly go ahead and actually navigate and show you maybe an example entry online. So again, if you go back to aflow.org, and now if you click on Prototype Encyclopedia, here you can see that this is the main entry page. You can search the different prototypes by different symmetry descriptors such as space group, Pearson symbol, the Structurbericht designation, and other attributes. And there's also this basic search functionality. So actually, if you hit search, it'll take you to a separate page. You can search on these different descriptors. And as an example, I'm going to search for corundum. And so you can see you've got 2 entries that fit that criteria, and I'm going to click on this first one. And so here you can see that we have a visualization of the structure. You can rotate it, display it in different formats. Here we have the prototype information, and I'll discuss what this label is in the next slide. We also have similar compounds. So what other compounds exhibit this prototype structure? Some comments. And then we also have the lattice and basis and atomic basis vectors. And you'll notice that they're in symbolic notation. And so what's nice about these AFLOW prototypes is you can change these degrees of freedom and actually change the underlying system by changing these coordinates. So the geometry might change slightly. And so at the bottom of each page, we also have an online prototype generator. So again, these degrees of freedom, which I'll discuss in the next slide, you can actually change these degrees of freedom, and you can create different geometry input files that correspond to this prototype structure by changing those degrees of freedom. And so we support different file formats. You can change the species as well to generate different compounds or different element decorations. And so going back to actually what this prototype label means and these degrees of freedom. So as part of this work, we wanted to come up with a descriptive labeling scheme for these prototypes. So for example, we took quartzite for this example. And so here, the prototype is designated by both a label and parameters. And so this label tells you a little bit of what the structure actually looks like. So it's a string separated by underscores that tells you what the reduced stoichiometry is, the Pearson symbol, the space group, and the Wyckoff letters. And then this alone doesn't tell you the exact structure that you have. You need to specify these degrees of freedom. So these are the AFLOW parameters. And so these are the parameters that are not fixed by symmetry. And so in this case, it's A, C over A, Z1, and Z2. And so you can actually change these parameters and slightly change the structure. So for example, you can change the C over A ratio, shrink the cell, or change the distances between some of the atoms. So this is a very powerful prototyping tool that you can use to generate many different structures and slightly change the degrees of freedom, but still have a structure that obeys this symmetry. And so that's the prototype encyclopedia that allows you to generate structures programmatically. And so the last part that I'll discuss briefly, these slides are just for your reference if you'd like to go back and see what is on the prototype page. But the last section is AFLOW-XtalFinder. And so here's some motivation. I think I've already motivated why this is important, but in the context of machine learning. But another thing that I want to mention is that XtalFinder can compare crystallographic structures. And so this is important for training machine learning models, because if we have maybe 100 rock salt structures, that can bias our machine learning model if we have duplicate entries. And so with XtalFinder, you can identify unique or duplicate structures regardless of what their unit cell representation looks like. And so this is really where XtalFinder comes into play. And it can also identify or classify the prototype of an arbitrary structure. So what I mean by this is you can take any coordinate model geometry file that you have, and again, using the self-consistent symmetry that I've shown, it can determine essentially this prototype label that I discussed before. So it can map to this label and degrees of freedom and determine for any arbitrary structure what the symmetry is, what the prototype designation is, and what these degrees of freedom are. And so again, this can be useful for training machine learning models because this label and parameters could also be features potentially in a training set. So that's the one component of XtalFinder. The other is you can, as I said, compare different crystals together. And so there's 3 different ways you can compare. You can do symmetry comparisons, so you can see whether or not structures have similar symmetries. You can check local geometry comparisons, so you can kind of zoom in on the structure and see what the atomic geometries or atomic environments look like if they're similar. And then you can do a robust mapping to see if structures map one-to-one onto one another. The other thing is we have some built-in methods to basically compare large data sets of structures. So you can compare your own sets of structures together, and AFLOW will automatically group them together by structural similarity. You can also compare your input structures to the prototype encyclopedia. So it'll take a generic structure and determine if there's a matching entry in the AFLOW encyclopedia. And the same can be done for the database. So you can input a structure and check to see if it matches to anything in the aflow.org repository. And it'll give you all the similar structures. And you can also print out their properties. So you can kind of glean this structural similarity versus properties to see that similar structures might have similar properties. And so I'll briefly show you where you can find this functionality online. Again, if you go to AFLOW Online, this functionality is shown. If you scroll down past symmetry, you can see structure comparison, so the XtalFinder. So again, you can compare things to the AFLOW database or the prototypes. Or you could also compare your, you can upload multiple structures and you can compare them together. And then the last function that I mentioned was this AFLOW-Prototype. So this will tell you the degrees of freedom and the label for your prototype. So just to show you one quick example how you can compare structures. Again, we've uploaded by default 2 structures. They should be there for everybody. And then if you just hit submit, it will compare these 2 structures together and determine their level of similarity, which is based on this misfit criteria. And that, if you'd like to learn more about what this criteria is, I encourage you to look at the AFLOW-XtalFinder article. All right, so with that, I did have some exercises, but in the interest of time, I will probably skip them. If people go through them and have some questions, I'd be happy to stay on for a little while and answer any questions, but I'll end by saying that I've shown a lot of the online functionality, but as Professor Tower said, you can actually download the AFLOW source code and install it on your own machine. And you can do even more symmetry functions and comparison functions by downloading it, running via the command line, or even the Python modules that we have. And so for usage, I would encourage you to look at this site here for how to use some of the command line tools and the Python scripts. And so with that, here's some articles about the topics that I know I've gone very quickly, but if you have any interest, you can look at these articles and look more about these tools. And so with that, I think I'll go ahead and hand it off to Dr. Osis. I've put the PDF of my presentation, so if you'd like to refer to anything, feel free to look at that. And again, I'm here for any questions.